A routine birth takes a terrifying turn. Only one puppy is born. But when the vet sees it, his hands start shaking. This isn't just any puppy. It has a birthmark, one that shouldn't exist, one that drags him back to a past he spent years trying to forget. He tells himself it's a coincidence, until the tests come back. And what they reveal? Impossible. What is this puppy? And why does it seem connected to him? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Dr. Ashford Kaplan stood at his clinic's front desk, methodically reviewing patient charts as he did every morning. The familiar smell of antiseptic and the quiet hum of fluorescent lights filled the air. His white coat was pristinely pressed, just like always, and his face wore its usual mask of professional detachment. Dr. Kaplan. Sarah, one of his nurses, burst through the entrance. We have an emergency. Margaret's here with Daisy. She's in labor. Ashford's head snapped up to see Margaret, her silver hair disheveled, supporting a panting golden retriever. Despite her obvious distress, Margaret's eyes held their characteristic warmth. She started having contractions an hour ago, Margaret explained, her voice trembling. Something feels different this time. Ashford quickly led them to the examination room, his steady hands guiding Daisy onto the table. The pregnant retriever whimpered softly, her belly swollen with what should have been a litter of puppies. It's all right, girl, he murmured, surprising himself with the gentleness in his voice. He hadn't spoken that way to anyone, human or animal, since Sarah, his wife. But he pushed that thought away. The delivery seemed routine at first. The staff worked efficiently, Margaret stroking Daisy's head and whispering encouragement. But after the first puppy emerged, a healthy male with golden fur, Daisy's contractions stopped. There should be more, Ashford frowned, performing an ultrasound. The x-rays showed at least 4 puppies last week. Minutes stretched into an hour. The single puppy nursed contentedly while his mother rested, but no siblings followed. Finally, Ashford had to accept the puzzling reality. This was a single puppy litter, something extremely rare for golden retrievers. Well, he's certainly special, Margaret smiled, cradling the tiny creature. Look at this marking on his chest. I've never seen anything like it. Ashford's hands froze mid-note on his clipboard. There, on the puppy's chest, was a distinctive white patch, shaped exactly like a small crescent moon. His throat tightened as Sarah's words echoed in his memory. If we have a girl, I want to paint a little crescent moon on her nursery wall. Wouldn't that be perfect? He blinked hard, trying to maintain his professional composure. But Margaret was watching him with those knowing eyes of hers, the ones that seemed to see straight through his carefully constructed walls. Dr. Kaplan, she asked softly, are you all right? Fine, he answered curtly, turning away to hide the emotion threatening to crack his voice. Just surprised by the single puppy. We'll need to monitor them both carefully. But Margaret's gentle hand on his arm made him pause. Sometimes, she said quietly, the most unexpected gifts are exactly what we need. I think I'll call him Lucky, Margaret announced, her eyes twinkling as she watched the golden puppy snuggle against his mother. Because that's exactly what he is, a blessing. Ashford methodically checked the puppy's vital signs, his stethoscope moving carefully across the tiny chest. The white crescent markings seemed to mock him with each movement. His hands remained steady, but his mind raced with unwanted memories. Heart rate normal, breathing clear. Weight is good for a newborn, he reported mechanically, making notes in the file. Despite being a single birth, he appears perfectly healthy. Margaret cradled Lucky in her arms, the puppy's eyes still tightly closed. He's more than healthy, Dr. Kaplan. There's something special about him. I can feel it. She paused, studying Ashford's face. "And I think you feel it too. That marking, does it remind you of something?" Ashford's jaw tightened. The clipboard in his hand suddenly felt heavy. "Mrs. Thompson, I need to complete these forms," he said sharply, turning away from her knowing gaze. "Sarah will help you schedule a follow-up appointment." Dr. Kaplan. Margaret's voice was gentle, like a grandmother trying to comfort a hurting child. "I've known you for years. I remember when you first opened this clinic, how different you were then. Sometimes the things that upset us most are the very things meant to heal us." "I don't need healing," he snapped, immediately regretting his harsh tone. He softened his voice but kept his back turned. "I need to focus on my patients, that's all." Margaret slowly rose, carefully holding Lucky. Sometimes miracles don't need explanations, just faith. She walked to the door, but stopped briefly. "You know where to find us when you're ready." Hours later, after the clinic had emptied and the lights dimmed, Ashford sat alone in his office. Lucky's medical file lay open on his desk, the overhead lamp casting shadows across the papers. His fingers traced the hastily drawn marking he'd sketched in the notes, the crescent moon that had haunted him all day. The same marking Sarah had wanted for their daughter's nursery, the nursery they'd never gotten to decorate. He stared at the simple drawing until his vision blurred, fighting the emotion rising in his throat. The logical part of his brain insisted it was just a coincidence, a random pattern in a puppy's fur. But something deeper, something he'd buried long ago, whispered that maybe Margaret was right. The clock ticked steadily in the quiet office as Ashford sat motionless, torn between what his mind could explain and what his heart couldn't deny. 3 weeks passed, and Lucky grew stronger each day. His golden fur gleamed, and his eyes sparkled with intelligence that seemed beyond his young age. During their scheduled checkup, Margaret watched with amusement as Lucky immediately bounded toward Ashford the moment they entered the examination room. "Well, look who has a new best friend," Margaret chuckled as Lucky pressed against Ashford's legs, tail wagging furiously. Ashford tried to maintain his professional demeanor, but Lucky's persistence made it difficult. "He's just excited. All puppies are like this." "Oh, I don't think so," Margaret said, shaking her head. "I've had many dogs in my life, Doctor Kaplan, but I've never seen one quite like Lucky. He's chosen you." "Dogs don't choose people, Mrs. Thompson. They respond to familiar scents and positive associations." Even as he spoke, Lucky had wandered behind his desk, nose twitching with interest. Before Ashford could stop him, Lucky squeezed into a narrow space between the filing cabinet and the wall. There was a scraping sound. Then Lucky emerged, holding something soft and blue in his mouth. Ashford's heart stopped. It was Sarah's scarf, the one she'd been wearing the day they met. He hadn't seen it in years, hadn't even remembered it was there. "Lucky, drop it," he commanded, his voice shaking. The puppy immediately obeyed, placing the scarf gently at Ashford's feet. Margaret picked it up, running her fingers over the delicate fabric. "It's beautiful," she said softly, "and well-loved, I can tell." "It was Sarah's," Ashford whispered, then caught himself. "I mean, it's nothing, just an old scarf that must have fallen behind the cabinet years ago." Margaret handed it back to him, her eyes kind. "Nothing is just nothing, Doctor Kaplan. Lucky found this for a reason." That night, Ashford lay in bed, Sarah's scarf clutched in his hands. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to really look at it, to remember. The soft cotton still held a trace of her favorite perfume, or maybe that was just his imagination. When sleep finally came, so did the dreams. But unlike the nightmares that had plagued him after the accident, This dream was different. Sarah stood before him, radiant and smiling, just as she had been that first day in the coffee shop. She reached out, her hand almost touching his cheek. "You're not alone," she whispered, her voice as clear as a bell. Ashford woke with tears on his cheeks, the scarf still wrapped around his fingers, and Lucky's words echoing in his mind. The following weeks brought a flurry of activity at the clinic. Lucky's routine checkups revealed something extraordinary. Cuts and scrapes that should have taken days to heal disappeared within hours. Even a minor ear infection cleared up overnight without medication. Ashford's scientific mind couldn't ignore these anomalies. During a particularly quiet afternoon, he drew blood samples from Lucky, who sat perfectly still, as if understanding the importance of the procedure. "I'm sending these to Dr. Patel at the genetics lab," Ashford told his head nurse, Jenny. "Something's not adding up with this puppy." "He's just special," Jenny said, scratching behind Lucky's ears. "Sometimes that's all there is to it." But Ashford couldn't accept that. He carefully packaged the samples and sent them to Dr. Patel, one of the country's leading veterinary genetic specialists. 3 days later, his office phone rang. "Dr. Kaplan?" Dr. Patel's voice sounded confused. "We need to discuss Lucky's results. There must be some contamination in the samples." "What do you mean?" "We've run the test 3 times. Each time we found human DNA markers mixed with the canine DNA. More specifically..." Dr. Patel paused. "The human markers match the control sample you provided. Your own DNA." Ashford's hand trembled as he held the phone. "That's impossible." "Exactly why we need new samples. This kind of cross-species DNA matching, it simply can't happen." But fresh samples showed the same results. By the 5th test, even Dr. Patel seemed shaken. "Dr. Kaplan, I've never seen anything like this. The markers aren't just similar. They're identical to yours. It's as if..." "As if what?" "As if part of you is literally part of him." Ashford hung up the phone and stared through his office window. Lucky lay in his usual spot by the reception desk, his golden head resting on his paws. As if sensing Ashford's gaze, the puppy lifted his head and looked directly at him with those knowing eyes. The room suddenly felt too small. Ashford's chest tightened as he locked his office door, dropping heavily into his chair. The test results lay scattered across his desk, undeniable proof of something that defied every law of nature he knew. Lucky scratched at the door, whining softly. Ashford pressed his hands against his temples, trying to make sense of it all. He was a man of science, of logic. He believed in what he could prove, what he could explain. But this shattered everything he thought he knew. His hands shook as he reached for the results again, reading and rereading the impossible truth before him. Ashford spent the next morning pacing in his office, phone in hand. Finally, he dialed Dr. Patel's number again. "There has to be a scientific explanation," he insisted, his voice tight with tension. "Some kind of genetic mutation we haven't discovered yet." Dr. Patel sighed on the other end of the line. "Dr. Kaplan, I've been studying genetics for 30 years. I've seen mutations, anomalies, and rarities of every kind. But this..." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "The markers we found aren't just similar to yours. They're exact matches. It's as if someone took pieces of your genetic code and wove them into Lucky's DNA." "That's impossible," Ashford said, running a hand through his graying hair. "Precisely my point. By every known law of genetics, this shouldn't exist. Yet here we are, with irrefutable evidence." The bell above the clinic's front door chimed, and Ashford looked up to see Margaret walking in. Lucky, who had been dozing in his usual spot by the reception desk, immediately bounded over to greet her. "I'll call you back," Ashford told Dr. Patel, hanging up. Margaret's wise eyes studied his face as she approached. "You look troubled, dear." "I'm fine," he said automatically, but his voice betrayed him. "You've been running tests on Lucky, haven't you?" She settled into a chair, her weathered hands folded in her lap. "Trying to figure out why he's special?" Ashford slumped against his desk. "The results don't make sense. None of this makes sense." "You're trying to solve this like a case," Margaret said softly. "But maybe it's something bigger than that." "What do you mean?" "Some things can't be explained with microscopes and test tubes, Ashford. Sometimes the universe works in ways we can't understand." Ashford felt his frustration bubble over. "I don't believe in miracles, Margaret. I'm a scientist. I deal in facts, in proof." Margaret smiled, the corners of her eyes crinkling. "Then maybe this one came to make you believe." Lucky padded over and placed his head on Ashford's knee, looking up at him with those knowing eyes. The birthmark on his chest, the one that matched the description his wife had once shared, seemed to stand out even more prominently against his golden fur. "Science explains everything," Ashford whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. "Does it explain love?" Margaret asked gently. "Does it explain why your heart still aches for Claire after all these years? Some things are beyond explanation, dear. They just are." The following days saw Ashford throwing himself into work, taking extra appointments and staying late at the clinic. But no matter how hard he tried to maintain his professional distance, Lucky seemed to have other plans. The golden retriever puppy had become a fixture at the clinic, following Ashford from room to room with unwavering devotion. "Go on, go rest," Ashford would say, pointing to Lucky's bed in the corner. But those warm brown eyes would just stare back at him, and the puppy would stay right by his side. One particularly quiet evening, after the staff had gone home, Ashford found himself sitting at his desk, absently scratching behind Lucky's ears while holding a worn photograph. In it, Claire smiled at the camera, her hand resting on her pregnant belly, her eyes full of hope for their future. "You would have loved this little troublemaker," Ashford whispered to the photo, surprising himself. He hadn't spoken to Claire's picture in years. "He's got that same stubborn streak you had." Lucky's tail thumped against the floor, and Ashford felt something stir in his chest, a warmth he'd forgotten existed. His fingers trembled as they traced Claire's face in the photograph. Suddenly, Lucky made a strange whimpering sound. Ashford looked down just in time to see the puppy collapse onto his side, body rigid, struggling for air. "Lucky!" Ashford's heart stopped. "No, no, no!" He dropped to his knees beside the puppy, hands shaking as he checked Lucky's vitals. The puppy's breathing was labored, his gums turning pale. "Stay with me," Ashford pleaded, his carefully constructed walls crumbling as panic seized him. He scooped Lucky up and rushed to the examination room, his mind racing through possible diagnoses, while his heart thundered with fear. The bell above the front door chimed, and Margaret's voice called out, "Ashford, I forgot my—" She stopped short at the doorway of the exam room, taking in the scene before her. "Help me," Ashford's voice cracked, something Margaret had never heard before. His hands moved swiftly, setting up oxygen, checking Lucky's heart rate. I can't lose him, too." Margaret rushed to his side, watching as the usually composed doctor's hands trembled while preparing an injection. For the first time since she'd known him, she saw raw fear in Ashford's eyes, the same look she'd seen in her mirror years ago when she'd faced losing someone she loved. "Please," Ashford whispered, and Margaret wasn't sure if he was talking to her, to Lucky, or to someone else entirely. Please don't go. The clinic burst into frantic activity as Ashford barked orders to the night staff, who had rushed in after his emergency call. Lucky lay motionless on the examination table, his breathing shallow and irregular. "Get me the cardiac monitor," Ashford commanded, his voice tight with tension, "and bring me the emergency kit, now!" Sarah, one of the younger technicians, fumbled with the equipment, startled by the unusual intensity in her boss's voice. She'd never seen Dr. Kaplan like this before. His face was pale, his hands trembling slightly as he worked. "Blood pressure's dropping," Tom, the senior technician, reported. "Heart rate irregular." Ashford's mind raced through every possibility, every treatment protocol he'd ever learned, but nothing seemed to work. Each medication he tried showed little effect. The monitors beeped ominously as Lucky's vital signs continued to fluctuate. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered, running his hands through his hair in frustration. "His labs were perfect just yesterday." Margaret stood in the corner, her hands clasped together in silent prayer. She watched as Ashford moved between monitors and medicine cabinets, his usual methodical approach giving way to increasingly desperate measures. Hours passed like this, a blur of medications, monitoring, and mounting anxiety. The staff exchanged worried glances, not just for Lucky, but for their usually stoic boss, who looked more undone with each passing minute. "Please," Ashford whispered, so quietly that only Margaret heard him, "don't take him too." Just when it seemed all hope was lost, Lucky's vital signs began to stabilize. First, his heart rate steadied, then his blood pressure normalized. Color returned to his gums, and his breathing became more regular. Ashford slumped against the wall, exhaustion etched across his face. The staff quietly filed out, leaving only Margaret, Ashford, and the now sleeping Lucky in the room. "The tests," Ashford said, his voice hoarse, "they show nothing. No infection, no organ failure, no explanation for what just happened." Margaret moved closer, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes the things that hurt us most don't show up on any test, Ashford." He looked up at her, his professional mask completely gone, replaced by raw vulnerability. "Maybe Lucky isn't the one who needs healing," Margaret said softly, her eyes full of understanding. "Maybe it's you." Ashford stared at the sleeping puppy, his chest tight with emotions he'd kept locked away for so long. For the first time in years, he didn't try to push them back down. The morning after Lucky's crisis, Ashford sat at his desk, surrounded by medical reports and test results. His hands shook slightly as he gathered the papers into a manila envelope addressed to Dr. Patel. Dark circles under his eyes betrayed another sleepless night. His phone rang an hour later. "Doctor? Kaplan?" Dr. Patel's voice carried an unusual edge. "I've reviewed Lucky's results." "And?" Ashford pressed, rubbing his temple against a growing headache. "This isn't natural, Ashford," Dr. Patel said slowly. "The DNA markers, the sudden illness, the connection to you, none of it follows any known scientific pattern." Ashford slumped in his chair. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that Lucky's existence defies explanation, and this bond between you—" Dr. Patel paused. "It's not just emotional, it's biological." As if on cue, Ashford's head throbbed harder. He'd been fighting these headaches for days now, along with a bone-deep exhaustion that coffee couldn't touch. Sarah knocked on his office door, concern evident on her face. "Doctor Kaplan? Your 3 o'clock is here, but maybe I should reschedule. You look awful." "I'm fine," he snapped, then immediately regretted his tone. "Sorry, I'm fine." "Ashford," Dr. Patel's voice drew his attention back to the phone. "There's something else. These symptoms you mentioned, The headaches, the fatigue. When did they start? Right after Lucky got sick, Ashford admitted. Listen carefully, Doctor. Patel's tone grew urgent. If Lucky is indeed linked to you biologically, his condition might be a reflection of something deeper, something you're not dealing with. Ashford's throat tightened. What do you mean? Grief, Ashford. The pain you've buried since losing your wife and child. Lucky's illness might be manifesting what you won't face. The words hit Ashford like a physical blow. Tom appeared in the doorway, holding a stack of charts, but stopped short at the sight of his boss's pale face. Dr. Kaplan, you need to rest, Tom insisted. We can handle things here. But Ashford barely heard him. Dr. Patel's next words commanded his full attention. If you want to save Lucky, you might need to save yourself first. Face what you've been running from, Ashford. Lucky's life may depend on it. Ashford's hands gripped the edge of his desk as the room seemed to spin around him. For the first time, he wondered if the pain in his chest wasn't just physical exhaustion, but the weight of years of unspoken grief finally demanding to be acknowledged. That evening, Ashford stumbled into his dark house, his head pounding. The day's conversation with Dr. Patel echoed in his mind as he dropped his keys on the kitchen counter. Lucky padded quietly behind him, watching his every move with concerned eyes. Ashford reached for the cabinet above the refrigerator, pulling out a bottle of whiskey he hadn't touched in years. The amber liquid splashed into a glass, and he drank deeply, welcoming the burning sensation. "Stop looking at me like that," he muttered to Lucky, who sat watching him with those knowing eyes. Moving to his study, Ashford slumped into his leather chair. Lucky followed, tail low but wagging slightly. The puppy went straight to the bottom drawer of Ashford's desk, the one he never opened anymore. "Leave it alone," Ashford said sharply, but Lucky persisted, pawing at the drawer. With trembling hands and another sip of whiskey for courage, Ashford pulled the drawer open. Inside lay a stack of old papers, and there, on top, was an envelope he'd forgotten existed. His wife's handwriting danced across the front. "For when you need me most." The whiskey glass clinked against his desk as he set it down. His fingers shook as he opened the envelope, unfolding the letter inside. The paper still held a hint of her perfume. "My dearest Ashford," he read aloud, his voice cracking. "If you're reading this, I'm gone. But love, real love, never truly dies." The words blurred as tears filled his eyes. She wrote about their dreams, the family they'd planned, the child they'd never meet. "I know you'll carry on," she'd written, "but please don't lock your heart away. Love finds ways to reach us, even across the greatest distances." Ashford took another long drink, trying to dull the ache in his chest. Lucky whimpered softly and disappeared behind the desk. When he returned, he was carrying something in his mouth, a photograph that had fallen years ago and slid beneath the furniture. It was their last picture together, taken just weeks before the accident. His wife's smile radiated joy, her hand resting protectively over her pregnant belly. Lucky placed the photo gently in Ashford's lap and looked up at him. In that moment, something extraordinary happened. Maybe it was the whiskey, or the emotional weight of the letter. But as Ashford gazed into Lucky's eyes, he saw something impossible. A warmth, a familiar light he thought he'd never see again. His wife's eyes had held that same gentle wisdom, that same unconditional love. "It can't be," he whispered. But for the first time since Lucky entered his life, he allowed himself to consider the impossible. The next morning, Ashford arrived at the clinic looking disheveled. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his usually pristine white coat was wrinkled. He fumbled with a simple vaccination nearly dropping the syringe. "Dr. Kaplan, are you feeling all right?" Sarah, his head nurse, asked gently. "I'm fine," he snapped, but his hands were shaking as he tried to update the patient charts. He'd written the wrong information 3 times already. Lucky lay in his usual spot in the corner of the exam room, watching Ashford with worried eyes. The puppy hadn't left his side since the night with the letter. By afternoon, Ashford had prescribed the wrong medication twice. Sarah had caught both mistakes before they reached the patients, but her concern was growing. She'd never seen him like this. The doctor who was always so precise, so controlled. "The DNA results," he muttered to himself while pacing his office. "There has to be an explanation. Maybe if we run the tests again." He was talking to himself more and more lately. Margaret arrived unannounced, her face etched with worry. She found Ashford surrounded by scattered papers, test results, medical journals, and genetic research articles. "This isn't healthy, Ashford," she said softly, watching him frantically flip through papers. "I'm close to understanding it, Margaret. These markers here..." His voice was desperate, almost frantic. "Stop." Margaret's voice was firm but gentle. She placed her hand over the papers he was holding. "You don't need to understand, Lucky. You just need to accept what he's here for." "And what exactly is that?" Ashford asked bitterly. "To torment me? To remind me of everything I've lost?" "To heal you," Margaret said simply. "But you're fighting it so hard." That night, Ashford tossed and turned in his bed. When sleep finally came, so did the dreams. His wife stood before him, beautiful as ever, her hand resting on her pregnant belly. "My love," she said softly, "you have to let go." "I can't," he whispered. "I don't know how." "Yes, you do." She smiled, that gentle smile he remembered so well. "That's why Lucky's here." Ashford jerked awake, gasping for air. The dream felt so real, her voice still echoing in his mind. But before he could process it, a terrible sound came from the floor beside his bed. Lucky was convulsing, his small body rigid and shaking. "No, no, no!" Ashford scrambled out of bed, his heart pounding with fear as he reached for the seizing puppy. Ashford cradled Lucky's convulsing body in his arms as he sped through the dark streets toward the clinic. His hands trembled on the steering wheel, and tears blurred his vision. Tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed in years. At the clinic, he burst through the doors, Lucky limp in his arms. Margaret was already there, having sensed something was wrong. She watched as Ashford frantically hooked Lucky up to monitors and prepared medications with shaking hands. "Nothing's working," he muttered, running his fingers through his disheveled hair. "I've tried everything in the book." His voice cracked as another treatment failed to stop Lucky's seizures. Margaret stepped closer, her eyes wet with tears. "Stop treating him like a case to solve. Just be there for him," she pleaded, her voice thick with emotion. Ashford stared at her, his professional facade crumbling. "What else can I do? I'm a doctor. This is what I do. I fix things." "No," Margaret said softly. "Right now, you need to be what Lucky needs, someone who loves him." Ashford looked down at the small golden retriever, still seizing on the examination table. Something inside him finally broke. He gathered Lucky into his arms, holding him close, and the walls he'd built around his heart for so long came crashing down. "I never," his voice caught, "I never let myself grieve her. Sarah, my wife." The tears came freely now. "I was so afraid of the pain. I thought if I just kept working, kept fixing other people's problems, I wouldn't have to face my own." He stroked Lucky's fur, his shoulders shaking with sobs. "I buried myself in work instead of burying my wife. I never even said goodbye properly. I was too scared to feel anything. I'm sorry, he whispered, pressing his forehead against Lucky's. I'm so sorry, Sarah. I'm sorry I couldn't save you. I'm sorry I couldn't save our baby. I'm sorry I've been running away for so long. As if responding to his words, Lucky's body suddenly stilled. The violent seizures ceased, and his breathing, which had been erratic, began to stabilize. Ashford watched in amazement as Lucky's vital signs returned to normal on the monitor. Margaret placed a gentle hand on Ashford's shoulder. Some wounds aren't meant to be treated, she said softly. They're meant to be felt. The morning sun streamed through the clinic windows, casting warm patches of light across the examination room floor. Lucky bounded around the space, chasing his tail and barking playfully as if the previous night's crisis had never happened. The clinic staff gathered at the doorway, watching in amazement as the once critical puppy radiated health and energy. I've never seen anything like it, whispered Jenny, one of the vet techs. Last night he was at death's door, and now... She shook her head in disbelief. Ashford stood in the corner, his white coat wrinkled from the long night, dark circles under his eyes. But there was something different about him. The rigid tension that had defined him for years had softened. He watched Lucky with wonder, his clinical detachment replaced by something warmer. Margaret sat nearby, knitting quietly and smiling to herself. She'd refused to leave after last night's breakthrough, claiming her old bones needed rest. But Ashford knew she was watching over both him and Lucky. The phone rang, cutting through the peaceful morning scene. Dr. Kaplan, his receptionist called out. It's Dr. Patel on line 1. Ashford picked up the phone, bracing himself for more scientific explanations or tests. But Dr. Patel's voice carried a note of wonder he'd never heard before. I've reviewed all the results again, Doctor, Patel said. I can't explain it scientifically, but whatever was affecting Lucky, it's gone now. It's like something inside you healed him. Ashford looked at Lucky, who had stopped playing and was now sitting at his feet, tail wagging, brown eyes fixed on him with that inexplicable warmth that had first unsettled him weeks ago. Thank you, Dr. Patel, Ashford said quietly, hanging up the phone. Margaret set down her knitting. Well, he says there's no scientific explanation, Ashford replied. But for the first time, the lack of a logical answer didn't bother him. He watched as Lucky rolled onto his back, paws in the air, inviting play. The corners of Ashford's mouth turned upward, slowly at first, as if remembering how. Then it spread into a genuine smile, the kind that reaches the eyes and warms the heart. He couldn't remember the last time he'd smiled like this. You know what, Margaret, he said, kneeling down to scratch Lucky's belly. I don't need an explanation anymore. Lucky's tail thumped against the floor in pure joy, and Ashford's smile grew wider. Something had shifted inside him, like a heavy door finally swinging open after years of being locked. The next morning dawned with unusual clarity. Ashford opened his eyes, momentarily confused by how refreshed he felt. For the first time in years, his sleep hadn't been plagued by restless thoughts or haunting dreams. He lay there, taking in the unfamiliar sensation of feeling lighter. At the clinic, Lucky pranced around the waiting room, greeting patients with his usual enthusiasm. Ashford watched him, noticing how the constant ache in his chest had softened to a gentle reminder rather than the crushing weight it had been for so long. Dr. Kaplan, Jenny approached with a stack of files. These need your signature. Thank you, Jenny, he said, then added something he'd never said before. You've been doing excellent work lately. I appreciate your dedication. Jenny's eyes widened in surprise, and a warm smile spread across her face. Thank you, sir. Throughout the morning, the staff exchanged meaningful glances as they witnessed small but significant changes in their usually stern boss. He stopped to chat with a worried pet owner, offering not just medical advice, but genuine comfort. He laughed at the receptionist's joke. He even brought coffee for the morning team. Margaret arrived around noon carrying her usual knitting bag. The moment she saw Ashford, she paused in the doorway, her wise eyes taking in the subtle changes in his demeanor. "Well, look at you," she said softly. Ashford raised an eyebrow. "Look at what?" "The shadows under your eyes are gone," she observed, settling into her favorite chair. "And you're standing straighter, like you set down a heavy load." He hadn't realized it until she mentioned it, but she was right. His shoulders felt looser, his breathing easier. "You're finally letting the past breathe, Ashford," Margaret said, pulling out her knitting needles. "That's all it ever needed." Later that afternoon, Ashford took Lucky home for their usual walk. The golden retriever seemed particularly excited, pulling toward the backyard with unusual determination. Before Ashford could redirect him, Lucky began digging frantically near the old oak tree. "Lucky, stop that!" Ashford called out. But then he saw something emerging from the dirt, a metal box, its surface dulled by years underground. His heart stopped. He recognized it immediately. Sarah's time capsule. She'd buried it the week before the accident, making him promise not to dig it up until she gave him permission. He'd forgotten all about it. With trembling hands, he lifted the box and opened it. Inside, preserved in a sealed plastic bag, lay a single envelope. On it, in Sarah's flowing handwriting, was his name. With trembling hands, Ashford held the dirt-covered time capsule. It was a simple metal box, now weathered with age, but he remembered the day his wife had buried it. Lucky sat beside him, tail wagging gently, as if understanding the weight of this moment. Inside, he found a pale blue envelope, the paper yellowed at the edges. His wife's delicate handwriting spelled out his name. The sight of it made his heart ache. He'd almost forgotten how she used to loop her whys. "I can't," he whispered, but Lucky nudged his hand with his wet nose. Taking a deep breath, Ashford unfolded the letter. "My dearest Ashford, I'm writing this during what our doctor calls the honeymoon phase of pregnancy. The morning sickness has finally passed, and I can feel our little miracle growing inside me. Today, I caught you talking to my belly when you thought I was sleeping. You were telling our baby about all the adventures you'd have together, teaching them to ride a bike, taking them camping, showing them the stars. I've never loved you more than in that moment. But something in my heart tells me to write this letter, just in case. Know that whatever happens, the love we've created is bigger than us. It's the kind that echoes through time, that finds ways to come back home." Ashford's vision blurred with tears. His hands shook so badly that Margaret, who had quietly arrived moments ago, steadied them with her own. "Keep reading," she whispered, sitting beside him on the grass. "Even if I'm not there, I know love will find its way back to you. When you see a sign, don't question it. Just believe." The dam finally broke. Years of carefully constructed walls crumbled as Ashford doubled over, deep sobs racking his body. Margaret's arm wrapped around his shoulders, holding him steady as he grieved openly for the first time since losing his family. Lucky crawled into his lap, licking the tears from his face. Through his blurred vision, Ashford looked into the puppy's eyes, those warm, knowing eyes that had haunted him since the day Lucky was born. The same eyes that had looked at him with his wife's gentle understanding. "She knew," he whispered, his voice raw. Somehow she knew love would find a way back. Margaret squeezed his shoulder. "Some things don't need scientific explanations, dear. They just need an open heart to believe in them. Ashford held Lucky close, feeling the puppy's heartbeat against his chest. For the first time, he didn't try to rationalize or question. He simply believed. The morning sun streamed through the clinic windows as Ashford organized his files, something different about his movements. They were slower, more relaxed, no longer carrying the rigid efficiency that had defined him for years. Lucky lay contentedly at his feet, occasionally thumping his tail against the floor when staff members passed by. Sarah, one of the veterinary technicians, noticed it first. Dr. Kaplan had actually stopped to chat with Mrs. Peterson about her cat's recovery, not just delivering clinical updates as he usually did. He'd even smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes, when she showed him pictures on her phone. "It's like watching a flower bloom," Jenny, the receptionist, whispered to Sarah. Who knew Dr. Kaplan could be so human? Lucky had become the clinic's unofficial mascot, greeting patients with a gentle wag and somehow knowing exactly which ones needed extra comfort. The staff had grown used to seeing the golden retriever trailing after Ashford, their steps perfectly in sync. During lunch breaks, instead of eating alone in his office reviewing cases, Ashford now took Lucky for walks through the nearby park. People who knew him as the serious veterinarian did double takes when they saw him throwing a ball for Lucky or simply sitting on a bench, sharing his sandwich with his four-legged companion. The biggest change came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. A young boy, no more than 7, burst into the clinic clutching a tiny black and white puppy. Tears streamed down his face as his mother explained that the puppy hadn't eaten in 2 days. The old Dr. Kaplan would have immediately whisked the puppy away for examination, leaving the emotional aspects to his staff. But this time, something different happened. Ashford knelt down to the boy's level, his voice gentle. "Hey there, what's your name?" "Tommy," the boy sniffled, holding his puppy closer. "Well, Tommy, I can see how much you love your puppy, and you did exactly the right thing bringing her here." Ashford's hand rested reassuringly on Tommy's shoulder. "I promise we'll do everything we can to help her feel better." The clinic staff froze in their tasks, watching the scene unfold. Sarah nearly dropped her clipboard. Jenny wiped away a tear. This was the same man who once communicated primarily through Post-it notes and clinical reports. Lucky padded over, nuzzling Tommy's hand, and for a moment the boy's sobs quieted. Ashford smiled, a warm, genuine expression that transformed his entire face. "See? Lucky here knows everything's going to be okay. And you know what? He's never wrong about these things." The staff exchanged knowing looks. The cold, distant Dr. Kaplan they'd known for years had been replaced by someone who finally understood that healing wasn't just about medicine, it was about heart. The storm came without warning, turning the peaceful town into a maze of flooded streets and howling winds. Rain pelted against the clinic windows as Ashford finished treating his last patient of the day. Lucky sat alert by the door, his ears perking up at every crack of thunder. The phone rang, cutting through the storm's chaos. Margaret's voice trembled on the other end. "Ashford, it's Daisy. She got spooked by the thunder and ran out. I can't find her anywhere, and the water's rising so fast." Without hesitation, Ashford grabbed his emergency kit and rain gear. The old him would have called emergency services and stayed safely inside. But now, the thought of Daisy, Lucky's mother, alone in the storm made his chest tight with worry. "We'll find her, Margaret. Lucky and I are on our way." The drive through flooded streets was treacherous. Lucky pressed his nose against the window, whining softly. When they reached Margaret's neighborhood, the water was already knee-deep. Ashford's heart pounded as he waded through the murky water, Lucky swimming beside him. "Daisy!" his voice barely carried over the wind. Lucky barked suddenly, pulling toward the creek that ran behind Margaret's house. The usually gentle stream had become a raging torrent. Through the sheets of rain, Ashford spotted her, Daisy, clinging desperately to a fallen tree branch caught in the current. Her golden fur was matted, her eyes wide with fear, as the branch shifted with each surge of water. "Hold on, girl," Ashford called out. The branch creaked ominously. Without thinking about the danger, about the freezing water or the current that could sweep him away, Ashford waded deeper. The water reached his chest, then his shoulders. Lucky's frantic barking echoed through the storm. Ashford reached the branch, his fingers brushing Daisy's wet fur. The branch shifted again, threatening to break free. "Come on, girl," he coaxed, reaching for her collar. Daisy whimpered, too scared to move. The current pulled at Ashford's legs, nearly knocking him over. He thought of Margaret, of Lucky, of all the love these dogs had brought into his life. He couldn't lose any of them. With a surge of strength, Ashford lunged forward, wrapping his arms around Daisy, just as the branch gave way. The current grabbed them both, pulling them under. Lucky's barking grew more intense, more urgent, a desperate call for help that carried through the storm. In the distance, flashlight beams cut through the rain. Rescue workers, drawn by Lucky's relentless barking, spotted Ashford struggling to keep Daisy's head above water. The rescue workers moved swiftly through the floodwaters, their strong arms pulling both Ashford and Daisy to safety. Ashford's body shook from the cold, his muscles aching from fighting the current. As the paramedics wrapped him in thermal blankets, he kept his eyes fixed on Daisy, refusing treatment until he knew she was okay. "She'll be fine, Doctor." "Kaplan," one of the rescue workers assured him. "Let's get you to the hospital." The next few hours passed in a blur of medical examinations and worried faces. Ashford found himself in a hospital bed, his body battered but nothing seriously damaged. Lucky hadn't left his side since they brought him in, somehow managing to dodge every nurse who tried to remove him. Margaret sat in the chair beside his bed, her weathered hands clasped together. "You would have never done that before," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Ashford turned to look at her, really look at her, and saw the truth in her eyes. The old Dr. Kaplan would have called emergency services and waited safely inside. He would have maintained professional distance. He would have remained logical, detached, cold. "I couldn't let her die," he said simply, his voice hoarse. "She's family now." Lucky pressed closer against his side, offering warmth and comfort. Ashford's hand found the dog's soft fur, drawing strength from the simple contact. Margaret leaned forward, her eyes twinkling despite her concern. "Something strange happened during the rescue," she said. "Lucky disappeared for a moment, right before they found you. It was like he was searching for someone." Ashford's heart skipped a beat. He remembered that moment under the water, when everything went dark and cold. For a split second, he'd felt a familiar presence, seen a flash of his wife's smile, heard her voice saying, "It's time to live again." "I think," Ashford said slowly, "I wasn't just saving Daisy tonight." He looked down at Lucky, who gazed back with those knowing eyes. "I was saving myself." Margaret reached out and squeezed his hand. "You've come so far, Ashford. From the man who couldn't feel to someone who'd risk his life to save another. That's what healing looks like." Lucky shifted, resting his head on Ashford's chest, right over his heart. The warmth spread through him, not just physical, but emotional, reaching places that had been cold for so long. For the first time in years, Ashford felt truly, completely alive. The morning sun cast long shadows across the clinic's parking lot as Ashford pulled in. Lucky sitting proudly in the passenger seat. His bruises from the flood rescue had faded, but the changes within him had only grown stronger. As he walked through the clinic doors, Lucky trotting faithfully beside him, the staff greeted him with warm smiles. "Welcome back, Doctor." Kaplan, Sarah, his head nurse, said with genuine affection. She'd worked with him for 5 years and had never seen him smile so freely. Throughout the day, Ashford noticed how differently he interacted with his patients and their owners. When Mrs. Chen brought in her elderly cat, he didn't just examine the animal. He sat with her, listening as she shared her worries about her pet's declining health. He found himself offering not just medical advice, but comfort and understanding. Lucky had become a fixture in the clinic, moving from patient to patient as if he knew exactly who needed extra attention. Children would ask specifically for the miracle dog, and their parents would share stories about how Lucky seemed to know when someone was hurting. "It's the strangest thing," one mother told Ashford as Lucky comforted her anxious daughter during a routine checkup. "Everyone in town knows about Lucky now. They say he's not just a dog, he's an angel in disguise." Margaret visited often, watching with quiet satisfaction as Ashford bloomed into the man she'd always known he could be. "You've given people more than medical care," she told him one afternoon. "You've given them hope." On a crisp Saturday morning, Ashford finally found the courage to do what he'd been avoiding for years. He drove to the cemetery, Lucky sitting quietly beside him. The fallen leaves crunched under his feet as he walked the familiar path to his wife's grave. The headstone was just as he remembered it, though now partially covered in autumn leaves. He brushed them away gently, his fingers tracing the carved letters of her name. Lucky sat beside him, unusually still and solemn. Ashford placed a single white rose on the grave, his hand trembling slightly. "I'm okay now," he whispered, his voice catching. "Thank you." A gentle breeze stirred the trees above them, sending more leaves dancing through the air. Lucky suddenly barked joyfully, his tail wagging as he looked up at the swaying branches. The wind seemed to wrap around them like a gentle embrace, and for a moment, Ashford could have sworn he felt her presence, not with sadness this time, but with peace. Back at the clinic, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically since Ashford's return. The once sterile halls now buzzed with warmth and chatter. Staff members who used to tiptoe around their boss now shared jokes and stories, while Lucky made his rounds, bringing smiles to everyone he met. "Dr. Kaplan," his receptionist called one morning. "The shelter called again. They're so grateful for the free checkups you've been offering." Ashford nodded, feeling a deep satisfaction he'd never known in his previous life of clinical detachment. Every Wednesday, he now dedicated his afternoons to examining rescued animals, something the old him would have dismissed as unprofitable sentimentality. The bell above the door chimed, and Lucky's ears perked up. A young woman with auburn hair stepped inside, clutching a small carrier. Ashford recognized her immediately, Rachel Thompson. 2 years ago, she had brought in her sick cat, and he had treated the situation with his typical cold efficiency. The cat hadn't survived, and he'd simply handed her a bill, showing no empathy for her loss. The waiting room fell silent. Everyone knew their history. Rachel approached the front desk hesitantly. I have a new kitten," she said softly. "I heard things were different here now, but—" Lucky padded over to her, gently nudging her hand. Rachel's tense shoulders relaxed slightly as she petted him. "Rachel," Ashford said, stepping forward, "I've thought about you and your cat often." His voice cracked slightly. "I was wrong back then, not just in how I treated you, but in how I treated everyone. I'm deeply sorry for your loss and for my coldness." Rachel's eyes widened at his sincerity. She opened the carrier, revealing a tiny black kitten. "Her name is Hope," she said. "I wasn't sure about coming here, but people in town keep talking about how you've changed. They say you're the doctor, they always wished you'd been." Ashford knelt down to examine the kitten, speaking gently to both pet and owner. "I can't change the past," he said, "but I can promise you'll never face that coldness here again." Rachel watched him tenderly check Hope's ears and heart. "You know," she said, wiping away a tear, "it's never too late to become the person you were meant to be." Margaret, who had been quietly observing from her usual corner chair, smiled knowingly as Lucky wagged his tail, moving between Ashford and Rachel as if blessing this moment of healing. The morning sun cast long shadows across Ashford's desk as he reviewed the paperwork for his newest project. The local animal shelter's adoption program needed more than just occasional free checkups. It needed a complete overhaul. Looking down at Lucky, who dozed peacefully at his feet, Ashford couldn't help but smile. "We're going to help them all find homes, boy," he whispered. Lucky's tail thumped against the floor in response. Margaret sat across from him, her weathered hands wrapped around a cup of tea. "You know, when you first suggested funding this program, I thought my hearing aids were playing tricks on me," she chuckled. "The old Ashford would have called it a waste of resources." "The old Ashford was wrong about many things," he replied, signing another document. "This is what love does," Margaret said softly, watching him work. "It gives without expecting anything in return." Later that afternoon, Ashford took Lucky for their usual walk through the town park. Children waved as they passed, and several people stopped to pat Lucky's head. The golden retriever had become something of a local celebrity, known for his gentle nature and uncanny ability to sense when someone needed comfort. Suddenly, Lucky pulled away from Ashford's grip. Before he could call him back, the dog trotted purposefully toward a bench where an elderly man sat alone, staring at nothing in particular. Lucky gently pressed his nose against the man's hand before curling up at his feet. The man startled, then looked down at Lucky with wide eyes. "Well, I'll be," he muttered, his voice thick with emotion. "He reminds me of a dog I had decades ago. Same gentle eyes, same way of looking right through you." Ashford approached slowly, watching as the man's trembling hand came to rest on Lucky's head. The dog leaned into the touch, his eyes half closed in contentment. "I lost my buddy 30 years ago," the man continued, speaking more to Lucky than to Ashford. "Haven't had the heart to get another dog since. But this fellow, there's something special about him." Ashford nodded, understanding completely. He watched as Lucky worked his particular magic, bringing comfort to yet another soul in need of healing. All around the park, people had stopped to witness the moment, their faces soft with recognition of something extraordinary happening in their midst. Standing there, Ashford realized that Lucky's gift wasn't just for him alone. The dog was changing the entire town, one heart at a time, creating ripples of healing that spread far beyond their little clinic. At the shelter, Ashford watched as Sophie, one of the dedicated volunteers, gently cleaned a rescued cat's injured paw. Her movements were careful and practiced, showing years of experience handling scared animals. Lucky sat nearby, his tail wagging whenever Sophie glanced his way. "You have quite a way with them," Ashford commented, noting how the usually skittish cat remained calm under her touch. Sophie smiled, her brown eyes warm. "They just need someone to be patient with them. Every animal has its own story, its own fears to overcome." She finished wrapping the paw and scratched behind the cat's ears. "Kinda like people, don't you think?" Ashford nodded, remembering his own journey. "Yes, exactly like people." Over the next few weeks, Ashford found himself looking forward to the days Sophie volunteered. They would often share coffee during breaks, talking about the animals and their progress. It was easy being around her. She never pushed her pride, just listened with genuine interest. One quiet afternoon, as they watched Lucky playing with some of the shelter puppies, Sophie opened up about her father. "He passed away 3 years ago," she said softly. "He loved animals more than anyone I've ever known. Starting to volunteer here, it helped me feel close to him again." Ashford felt something shift inside him, a wall coming down. "I understand," he said, surprising himself with what came next. "My wife, Sarah. She was the same way. She would have loved this place." His voice remained steady, the pain still there, but different now, more like an old photograph than an open wound. "Tell me about her," Sophie said gently. And he did. He told her about Sarah's laugh, her dreams for their future, the way she would dance in the kitchen while making breakfast. For the first time, sharing these memories brought more warmth than sorrow. Margaret, who had been quietly organizing supplies nearby, couldn't help but notice the easy way they talked. Later, as Sophie left for the day, Margaret gave Ashford a knowing look. "What?" he asked, recognizing the mischievous glint in her eye. "Oh, nothing," Margaret said with a smile. "Just noticing how love finds its way in, even when you don't expect it." "Margaret," Ashford protested, feeling his cheeks warm. "Sophie and I are just friends." "Mm-hmm," Margaret hummed, patting his arm. "Whatever you say, dear." Ashford shook his head, but as he watched Sophie's car pull away, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a flutter of possibility, a hint that maybe his heart wasn't finished growing after all. The call came on a quiet Sunday morning. Ashford had just finished his morning coffee when the hospital contacted him about Margaret. She had collapsed in her garden, and the doctors discovered what they'd feared. Her heart was failing. Ashford rushed to the hospital, Lucky faithfully by his side. The sterile hallways felt longer than usual as he made his way to her room. Sophie met him there, her eyes red from crying. Margaret lay in the hospital bed, looking smaller and more fragile than he'd ever seen her, but her smile remained as warm as ever. "There you are," she said softly as Ashford approached. Lucky immediately went to her bedside, gently placing his head near her hand. "You should have told me you weren't feeling well," Ashford said, his voice thick with emotion. Margaret chuckled weakly. "And have you worrying over me?" "That's not what you needed." She patted Lucky's head. "Besides, I've lived a full life, and I have no regrets." Tears welled up in Ashford's eyes. This woman had been more than just a friend. She'd been his guide, his conscience, his second chance at understanding love. "Promise me something," Margaret said, her voice growing fainter. "Promise you won't close your heart again after I'm gone. You've come too far to go back to that lonely place." Ashford took her hand, feeling its fragile warmth. "I promise," he whispered. "I'll keep helping others, just like you taught me." Margaret's eyes sparkled, despite her weakness. "Lucky wasn't just meant to heal you, you know." She paused, catching her breath. "He was meant to teach you how to live again." Sophie stood quietly by the door, wiping tears from her cheeks as she watched the exchange. The room fell silent except for the steady beep of monitors. Margaret's breathing grew slower, more peaceful. Lucky, who had remained perfectly still by her side, lifted his head and let out a soft, mournful howl. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just a gentle sound of farewell, as if he understood exactly what was happening. Then he rested his head beside her hand again, his eyes fixed on her face as she took her final breath. The room fell silent, and Ashford felt the weight of loss settle over him, different from before, but no less profound. Sophie stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Ashford's shoulder as tears rolled down his cheeks. Lucky stayed where he was, maintaining his vigil, a living testament to everything Margaret had taught them about love, loyalty, and the courage to keep your heart open, even in the face of loss. In the weeks following Margaret's passing, Ashford threw himself into realizing her dream. The clinic's empty storage room transformed into a bright, welcoming adoption center, complete with comfortable beds and play areas for rescued animals. He named it Margaret's Haven, and her photo hung proudly near the entrance, her warm smile watching over all who entered. Lucky seemed to understand his role perfectly. Each morning, he'd make his rounds through the clinic, stopping to comfort nervous pets and their worried owners. Sometimes he'd sit for hours with children whose pets were in surgery, letting them hug him and cry into his soft fur. Sophie took charge of the volunteer program, her natural warmth drawing in people who shared Margaret's vision. She and Ashford found themselves working side by side more often, their shared grief over Margaret slowly transforming into something lighter, more hopeful. "She would have loved this," Sophie said one afternoon, watching Lucky guide a scared rescue dog into the center. Ashford nodded, noticing how the sunlight caught in Sophie's hair, how her smile reminded him that life could still hold beauty. The clinic staff noticed the change in their boss too. Gone was the cold, distant doctor who avoided emotional attachment. In his place stood a man who took time to listen, to comfort, to share in both the joys and sorrows of his patients and their owners. One rainy Tuesday morning, a woman rushed into the clinic, cradling a wet bundle in her arms. "I found her behind the grocery store," she explained breathlessly. "She was all alone, scared to death." Ashford gently took the trembling dog, a young golden retriever mix, and began his examination. As he parted the wet fur to check for injuries, he froze. There, on the dog's chest, was a distinctive mark, identical to Lucky's birthmark. The woman noticed his reaction. "Is something wrong?" Lucky, who had been watching from nearby, padded over and sniffed the newcomer. His tail began to wag as he gently nuzzled the scared dog, who immediately relaxed under his attention. Sophie appeared in the doorway, catching Ashford's stunned expression. She walked over and gasped when she saw the mark. "It's just like Lucky's," Ashford finished, his voice soft with wonder. He reached down to pet the rescued dog, who leaned into his touch just as Lucky had done all those months ago. "Maybe miracles do exist," he whispered, remembering Margaret's words about signs and faith. The new dog looked up at him with trusting eyes, and Ashford felt that familiar tug in his heart, the one that reminded him how far he'd come from the man who once feared to feel anything at all. Lucky sat beside them, his presence a steady reminder of the journey that had brought them all here, to this moment of unexpected grace. The autumn breeze carried the excited chatter of townspeople gathered outside the newly renovated building. Colorful balloons and streamers decorated the entrance of what was once just a small veterinary clinic. Now, Margaret's Haven Animal Rescue Center stood proudly emblazoned on a wooden sign, hand-carved by local artisans. Ashford adjusted his tie nervously, standing before the crowd. The past few months had been a whirlwind of construction, paperwork, and preparation. Sophie squeezed his hand gently, her presence beside him as steady as it had been since Margaret's passing. Lucky sat perfectly still at the entrance, his golden fur gleaming in the morning sun. The rescued dog with the matching birthmark, now named Hope, lay beside him, both watching the proceedings with what seemed like understanding in their eyes. "Margaret always believed in second chances," Ashford began, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd. "She taught me that healing isn't just about medicine, it's about opening your heart, even when you're scared." He paused, swallowing the lump in his throat. This center is her legacy, a place where every animal gets the chance they deserve. Sophie stepped forward, holding the large ceremonial scissors. Together, they cut the red ribbon and applause erupted from the crowd. Lucky barked once, as if adding his own approval to the moment. Inside, the transformation was remarkable. The sterile walls of the old storage room had given way to warm, cheerful colors. Comfortable beds lined the walls, and play areas filled with toys occupied the center space. Photos of successfully adopted pets already decorated one wall, with Margaret's smiling portrait watching over them all. The townspeople filed in, exclaiming over the changes. Mrs. Chen, who had once been afraid to bring her cat to the cold Dr. Kaplan, now hugged him tearfully. "Margaret would be so proud," she whispered. As the afternoon wore on, 3 animals found new homes, including Hope, who bonded immediately with a quiet elderly man who had recently lost his wife. Watching them leave together, Ashford felt a familiar warmth in his chest, the kind that no longer scared him. Later that evening, after the excitement had died down, Ashford took Lucky for their usual walk through town. The streets were quiet, bathed in the golden light of sunset. They passed the park where Lucky had first comforted that lonely old man, the shelter where Sophie had first caught his eye, and finally, the bench where Margaret used to sit and feed the birds. The evening wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it a sound that made Ashford stop in his tracks. It was light and musical, his wife's laughter, just as he remembered it. Instead of the sharp pain such memories once brought, he felt only peace. Lucky looked up at him, tail wagging gently, those knowing eyes reflecting the last rays of sunlight. Ashford smiled down at his faithful companion, understanding finally settling in his heart. This was home, not just the physical place, but this feeling of being exactly where he was meant to be. The morning sun streamed through the large windows of Margaret's Animal Rescue Center, casting warm patches of light across the freshly painted walls. The sound of barking, meowing, and happy chatter filled the air as families wandered through the spacious rooms, looking for their perfect companion. Ashford stood near the reception desk, watching a young girl giggle as a tabby cat rubbed against her legs. Just months ago, such scenes would have made him retreat to his office, burying himself in paperwork. Now he found himself smiling, his heart light with the joy of witnessing these connections. Lucky bounded between the play areas, his golden fur catching the sunlight as he guided a group of rescued puppies in a game of chase. He seemed to have a special way with the newer arrivals, especially the scared ones. Sometimes he would lie beside them, offering silent comfort until they felt brave enough to explore their surroundings. "Remember when he was that small?" Sophie asked, appearing beside Ashford with a cup of coffee in her hand. She nodded toward Lucky, who was now letting a tiny black puppy climb over his back. "Feels like yesterday," Ashford replied softly, accepting the coffee. "And a lifetime ago at the same time." The bell above the door chimed, and they both turned to see a woman enter, cradling something in her arms. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and her hands trembled slightly as she approached the desk. "Can you help?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. In her arms lay a small dog, its fur matted and dirty, ribs showing through its skin. "I found him behind the grocery store. He wouldn't let anyone near him for days, but this morning—" She trailed off, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm Amelia," she added quickly, as if remembering her manners. "I couldn't just leave him there." Ashford moved forward, his movements slow and gentle. The dog lifted its head slightly, eyes wary, but not fearful. Something about its gaze reminded him so much of Lucky's first day at the clinic, that mix of uncertainty and hope. Kneeling beside Amelia, Ashford carefully extended his hand, letting the dog catch his scent. "You're safe now," he said softly, his voice carrying the warmth that had once been so foreign to him. "We'll take care of you." The dog sniffed his hand, and after a moment, gave it a tiny lick. Ashford felt Sophie's hand slip into his free one, squeezing gently. He didn't need to look up to know she was smiling. She always did when she caught glimpses of how much he'd changed. Lucky padded over, his tail wagging slowly as he approached the newcomer. He sat patiently nearby, as if saying, "I know exactly how you feel. Trust them. They help me too." Ashford felt a warmth spread through his chest as he watched the interaction. The cold, clinical doctor who once saw animals as mere cases to solve was gone. In his place stood someone who understood that healing wasn't just about medicine. It was about love, patience, and the courage to care. The afternoon light was fading as Ashford sat at his desk, surrounded by paperwork. Legal documents for the Margaret Walker Foundation were spread across the surface, each one bringing him closer to ensuring Margaret's legacy would live on. Lucky dozed peacefully in his usual spot by the window, occasionally lifting his head to check on his human companion. "I thought I'd find you buried in forms," Sophie said, stepping into the office with 2 steaming cups of tea. She placed one beside Ashford, careful not to disturb the organized chaos of papers. Ashford looked up, his eyes tired, but bright with purpose. "These bylaws won't write themselves," he said, accepting the tea gratefully. "I want to make sure everything's perfect. Margaret deserved nothing less." Sophie pulled up a chair beside him, her shoulder brushing against his. She leaned in to look at the documents. "The foundation will help so many animals," she said softly, "and they're humans too." "Just like Margaret helped me," Ashford replied, his voice thick with emotion. He turned to face Sophie, really looking at her. The way she'd stood by him these past months, helping him transform the clinic into something greater than he'd ever imagined. The way she understood his silences and celebrated his small victories. "I never thought I'd be here," he admitted, gesturing around the office. "Running a rescue center, starting a foundation, actually looking forward to each new day." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "Thank you, Sophie, for helping me remember how to open my heart again." Lucky padded over, settling between their chairs as if he knew this moment needed his presence. Sophie reached down to scratch behind his ears, smiling as the golden retriever leaned into her touch. "Well," she said, a playful glint in her eyes, "we make a pretty good team. Maybe we should make this partnership official." Her tone was light, but there was an undercurrent of something deeper, something real. For a moment, Ashford just looked at her, and then something remarkable happened. He laughed, not the polite chuckle he'd learned to use with clients, but a genuine, heartfelt laugh that seemed to come from somewhere long forgotten. "You know what's funny?" he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "I was just about to say the same thing." Sophie's smile widened, and she reached for his hand across the desk. Their fingers intertwined naturally, comfortably, like they'd been doing this for years instead of months. There was no rush, no pressure. Just the quiet understanding that they'd found something special in each other. Lucky wagged his tail, looking between them with what could only be described as satisfaction. After all, he'd been watching their slow dance toward each other all along, witnessing every small step that led to this moment. Ashford squeezed Sophie's hand gently, marveling at how right it felt. This wasn't the whirlwind romance of youth. It was something deeper, built on shared experiences, mutual understanding, and the kind of trust that only comes from healing together. The rescue center buzzed with activity as families wandered between kennels and play areas. Colorful balloons decorated the entrance, and volunteers guided potential adopters through the facility. Ashford stood near the reception desk, watching the scene with quiet satisfaction, while Lucky sat attentively by his side. "We've already had 3 successful adoptions this morning," Sophie said, sliding up beside him and brushing her hand against his. "Margaret would have loved this." Before Ashford could respond, Lucky suddenly perked up. His ears twitched, and without warning, he trotted purposefully across the room toward a small girl sitting alone on a bench. She couldn't have been more than 7, her shoulders hunched and eyes downcast. "That's Emily," Sophie whispered. "Her mother told me they lost her father 3 months ago. They came hoping a pet might help her cope." Lucky approached the girl gently, pressing his nose against her hand. Emily looked up, startled, then watched as Lucky settled beside her, laying his head in her lap. Tears welled up in her eyes, but for the first time that day, she smiled. Ashford's throat tightened as he watched. He recognized that look, the same comfort Lucky had offered him when his own grief seemed unbearable. The dog's warmth and presence seemed to wrap around Emily like a protective blanket. "He always knows," Ashford said softly. "Somehow, he always knows who needs him most." The afternoon continued, filled with happy barks and excited chatter, until an elderly man walked through the doors. He moved slowly, leaning on a cane, his weathered face speaking of years lived and memories carried. Lucky's head snapped up from where he'd been resting near Emily. He stood, tail wagging, and walked directly to the man. The elderly visitor froze, his eyes widening as he stared at the golden retriever. "That marking?" The man gasped, lowering himself carefully to one knee. "It can't be." Ashford approached, concerned about the man's reaction. "Sir, are you all right?" "That birthmark," the man said, his voice trembling. "My Sarah. She had a dog with the exact same mark years ago. Right there, just like a little heart." His fingers hovered over Lucky's fur, where the distinctive marking showed clearly. "Sarah always said that dog was an angel sent to keep her company through her illness." Tears rolled down the man's cheeks as Lucky pressed closer, offering the same gentle comfort he'd shown so many others. "You remind me of her," the man whispered, running his hands through Lucky's fur. Maybe she sent you to tell me I'm not alone." Ashford stood transfixed, watching the scene unfold. In that moment, everything clicked into place. Lucky's mysterious appearance, his uncanny ability to find those who needed healing most, the impossible connection they shared. The dog had never been just his miracle. Lucky was exactly what his name suggested, a blessing meant to be shared, bringing light to dark places and comfort to hurting hearts. Sophie slipped her hand into Ashford's, squeezing gently as they watched Lucky work his special magic once again. The evening sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk as Ashford and Lucky took their usual route through town. The air was crisp, carrying the sweet scent of blooming jasmine, his wife's favorite flower. Lucky trotted contentedly beside him, occasionally glancing up as if checking that Ashford was still present in the moment. They passed familiar storefronts, each holding memories that no longer stung like they used to. When they approached Marie's Cafe, Ashford's steps slowed. The quaint little coffee shop with its red awning and brass bell above the door had been his wife's favorite spot. For years after her death, he'd taken alternate routes just to avoid seeing it. But tonight, something was different. The warm, golden light spilling from its windows reminded him of Sunday mornings when they'd share croissants and coffee, planning their future together. The memory brought a gentle smile to his face instead of the usual ache in his chest. She always said they made the best chocolate croissants in town, Ashford murmured to Lucky, who wagged his tail as if understanding. We'd sit by that window there, and she'd spread out her medical journals, but end up people-watching instead. As they continued past the cafe, Lucky suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. His ears perked forward, and his tail began wagging with increasing enthusiasm. Ashford followed the dog's gaze across the street, and his breath caught in his throat. There, in the small park across the way, a woman with auburn hair was playing fetch with a golden retriever. Her laughter carried across the evening air, pure and joyful. The sight struck him with its familiar beauty. The way she threw her head back when she laughed, the graceful movement of her hands as she tossed the ball, the pure delight radiating from her entire being. For a moment, just a moment, it was like seeing his wife again. Not as a ghost or a painful reminder of loss, but as a beautiful memory of what love looked like in its purest form. The woman across the street wasn't her, of course, but the joy she exhibited was the same. That simple, unrestrained happiness his wife had always embodied. Ashford felt tears well up in his eyes, but they weren't bitter or sad. They were grateful tears, full of understanding and acceptance. Lucky pressed against his leg, offering his steady, warm presence. "You know," Ashford whispered, kneeling beside Lucky and running his hands through the dog's soft fur, "I used to think losing her meant losing love forever. But that's not how it works, is it?" Lucky's brown eyes met his, full of that inexplicable wisdom that had guided Ashford back to life. "She didn't leave me alone," he continued softly, watching the woman and her dog play across the street. "She made sure love would find its way back to me." His voice caught as he finally understood the truth that had been there all along. Looking up at the deepening twilight sky, he whispered, "Thank you for sending him to me." Lucky gently licked his hand, as if sealing the moment with his own kind of blessing. The autumn leaves danced across the sidewalk leading to Margaret's Animal Rescue Center, where the morning sun illuminated the freshly painted sign. Inside, Ashford stood at the reception desk, reviewing adoption papers while Lucky dozed contentedly at his feet. The center had grown beyond his wildest dreams, becoming a beacon of hope for both animals and people in need of healing. Sophie appeared beside him, her presence as natural as breathing now. She placed a steaming cup of coffee next to his paperwork, just the way he liked it, black with a hint of cinnamon. Their fingers brushed briefly as she handed him the local newspaper. "Have you seen this?" she asked, her eyes twinkling. "Our Lucky's made the front page." Ashford adjusted his reading glasses and smiled at the headline, "Miracle Dog Continues to Transform Lives." The article detailed Lucky's journey from a mysterious single-birth puppy to becoming the heart and soul of the rescue center. There were quotes from townspeople whose lives had been touched by the golden retriever's inexplicable ability to sense emotional pain and offer comfort. "They interviewed Mrs. Henderson," Sophie pointed out, leaning closer to read. "Remember how Lucky wouldn't leave her side after she lost her husband?" Ashford nodded, remembering how Lucky had spent 3 straight days by the elderly woman's side, somehow knowing exactly when she needed him most. The article went on to describe similar instances, Lucky finding lost pets, comforting grieving children, even detecting illness in animals before symptoms showed. Throughout the day, people stopped by the center to congratulate them on the article. Some brought treats for Lucky, others shared their own stories of how the rescue center had changed their lives. Ashford watched it all with quiet amazement, still sometimes stunned by how different his life had become. In the evening, as Sophie was preparing to leave, she paused at the door. "Join me for dinner tomorrow," she asked, her voice casual, but her eyes holding something deeper. "I found this little Italian place that reminds me of Marie's Cafe." The mention of his wife's favorite restaurant no longer caused Ashford pain. Instead, it brought warm memories and a gentle appreciation for how Sophie always honored his past while helping him build a future. "I'd like that," he replied softly. Their relationship had evolved like the changing of seasons, gradual, natural, and beautiful in its own time. Neither of them felt the need to rush or define what they were becoming. They simply enjoyed each other's company, sharing quiet moments between caring for animals and building their dream of helping others. Later that night, Ashford sat in his study, Lucky curled up in his usual spot on the old leather armchair. The autumn wind whistled gently outside, rustling through the trees in a familiar melody. As he prepared for bed, Lucky padded after him, tail wagging lazily. The dog settled into his plush bed beside Ashford's, a routine they'd established months ago. Ashford knelt to tuck Lucky's favorite blanket around him, a small gesture that had become sacred between them. Suddenly, the wind changed. It wasn't just a breeze anymore. It was softer, warmer, carrying a scent he hadn't experienced in years. The familiar trace of jasmine filled the room, and the air seemed to hold its breath. Then he heard it, soft as a whisper, clear as morning light. "You're ready now." Ashford's heart skipped a beat. He knew that voice, would know it anywhere. It was her, his wife, speaking from wherever love continues to exist. He didn't turn around, didn't need to. The gentle presence behind him was as familiar as his own heartbeat. Lucky lifted his head, his eyes focused on something Ashford couldn't see, tail wagging slowly. The dog seemed completely unsurprised, as if he'd been waiting for this moment all along. Tears rolled down Ashford's cheeks, but they weren't tears of loss or longing. They were tears of understanding, of gratitude, of love that had transformed rather than disappeared. He reached down to stroke Lucky's fur, feeling the connection between past and present, between loss and renewal, between endings and new beginnings. The autumn evening painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink as crowds gathered at Margaret's Animal Rescue Center. Paper lanterns swayed gently in the breeze, and the excited chatter of townspeople filled the air. Children played with the rescue dogs in the yard, while their parents shared stories of how the center had touched their lives. Ashford stood at the podium, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his notes. Sophie squeezed his arm reassuringly, her presence steady and warm beside him. Lucky sat at his feet, tail wagging contentedly as he surveyed the crowd. "A year ago," Ashford began, his voice carrying across the hushed gathering, "I wouldn't have believed any of this was possible. I was a different man then. Someone who thought healing meant avoiding pain, who believed that love was something you could lock away and forget." He paused, looking down at Lucky, who gazed back with those knowing eyes that had first stirred something in his heart months ago. "But then this remarkable dog came into my life, bringing with him lessons I didn't know I needed to learn." Ashford's voice grew stronger as he continued, "And there was Margaret. Dear Margaret, who saw through all my walls and never stopped believing in the power of second chances. She taught me that love never truly leaves us. It just transforms, finding new ways to touch our lives when we least expect it." Several people in the crowd wiped away tears, nodding in recognition of the woman who had touched so many lives. Mrs. Henderson, clutching a tissue, smiled through her tears as she remembered how Margaret had helped her find her beloved cat years ago. "This center isn't just about saving animals," Ashford continued, gesturing to the building behind him. "It's about saving each other. It's about understanding that healing isn't something we do alone. Sometimes it takes a miracle dog, a wise friend, or even a whole community to show us the way back to life." Sophie's eyes glistened with pride as she watched the man she'd grown to care for deeply share his journey with others. She knew his past would always be part of him, but now it enhanced rather than hindered his ability to love. "So thank you," Ashford said, his voice thick with emotion, "for being part of this journey. Thank you for helping us create something that would make Margaret proud. And most of all, thank you for showing me that it's never too late to open your heart again." As the crowd erupted in applause, Lucky suddenly stood up, his ears perking forward. He barked joyfully, a sound full of life and celebration, and bounded toward the setting sun. His golden fur caught the light, making him appear to glow as he ran across the lawn. Ashford watched him go, and for the first time in years, his eyes held no trace of the grief that had once defined him. Instead, they shone with pure gratitude, reflecting the golden light of the evening. His smile was easy and natural as Lucky circled back, weaving through the crowd to return to his side. The setting sun cast long shadows across the lawn, and as people began to mingle and share refreshments, Ashford felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. Lucky pressed against his leg, looking up at him with those soulful eyes that had started it all. Ashford chuckled as Lucky nudged his hand, whispering, "All right, boy, let's go home." If you enjoyed the story of Dr. Ashford and Lucky, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't. If you enjoyed the story of Dr. Ashford and Lucky, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.